feel like there's some exercises that trainers will get you to do and you're like, what is the point of this? But the science backs it up that these are really effective exercise to have in your training program if you are trying to target your glute muscles and your hamstring muscles. Hi, so in this video I'm going to explain 6 different exercises based off of different research studies that were primarily conducted on women performing a bunch of different exercises. And these studies essentially demonstrated that there is evidence that these exercises are effective at increasing our muscle mass, decreasing our body fat percentage, and also increasing our strength. The very first exercise are hip thrusts, and apologies if I'm looking down on my iPad. I did not memorize all of this information. I was taking notes on all of the studies. But essentially, if you're on gym TikTok, you've definitely seen hip thrusts before. Hip thrusts are a type of bridging exercise performed against an external barbell resistance, and they are used to develop the hip extensor muscles, as you can see here. And there was one study that directly compared women that were performing hip thrusts against women that were performing back squat. In this study, they found that the women that were performing the hip thrust actually had higher levels of activation in their glutes than the women that were performing the back squats when they were using the highest weight that they could thrust for 10 repetitions. And that's a really huge finding if your goal in the gym is to improve the growth and the strength of your glute muscles and your hamstrings. There was also a 7-week training study that was done on young female soccer players, and in this study they split the athletes into 3 groups. There was a back squat group, a hip thrust group, and a control group. And in this particular study they found that the hip thrust group had greater improvements in their 10-meter sprint and their 20-meter sprint compared to the back squat group and the hip thrust group. And I think it's really important to note that with research studies you can always find conflicting evidence. Like, you might find another study that actually demonstrates that back squats in this particular group had greater activation or greater strength, greater improvements in back squats than the hip thrust group. Like, I feel like exercise science, there's a lot of conflicting evidence. I think a big takeaway from these 2 research studies is that hip thrusts are an effective exercise for women to do in the gym, especially if you've been going to the gym for a long time and you feel like you're not really seeing the improvements or the growth in these particular muscle groups. I know from personal experience, when I started going to the gym, I was just doing workouts that I saw on YouTube. I wasn't really seeing a remarkable difference in my glute and my hamstring muscles. But then I did personal training for about 10 months, and hip thrusts were a staple in my personal training program. That was when I finally saw a difference in my glute muscles and my hamstring muscles. I personally noticed that my body fat percentage was decreasing, my muscle mass was increasing. I checked myself every single week, and when I started incorporating hip thrusts in my workout routine, I notice the biggest difference. So throughout the week when you're in the gym, doing hip thrusts are so beneficial, and the science backs it up. And that's why I feel like when you go on TikTok, people are always doing hip thrusts because they really are that effective. And I really wanted to only stick to studies that were conducted on women, but I did find a really interesting study that was done on men. The study was conducted on 19 resistance trained males that were performing the hip thrust. And essentially the study results demonstrated that the hip thrust places a large and significantly greater extensor demand bilaterally on the hip joint. The study supports the evidence that incorporating barbell hip thrusts are effective for developing the hip extensor muscles. As well, all of my citations will be in the description box. I may have overlooked some things in the studies, so everything will be in the description box. So the next exercise is Romanian deadlifts and also Romanian chair back extensions. So there was a study conducted on women to specifically take a look at their neuromuscular activation in these muscle groups: your gluteus maximus, your bicep femoris, and the erector spine. And the women were performing the Romanian deadlift, 45-degree chair back extension, and the seated machine back extension. The study found that the Romanian deadlift and the Romanian chair back extension activated the gluteus maximus more than the seated machine back extension, and they also activated the hamstring muscles more than the seated back extension. Interestingly, the Romanian chair back extension had higher activation compared to both the RDL and the seated machine back extension. And I don't know if you've ever done the Romanian chair back extensions in the gym. My trainer would always get me to do them, and personally, it just doesn't, like, I feel like there's some exercises that trainers will get you to do and you're like, what is the point of this? But the science backs it up that these are really effective exercise to have in your training program if you are trying to target your glute muscles and your hamstring muscles. And interestingly, again, the analysis for the different parts of the movement showed that the Romanian chair actually activated higher levels of activation in the upper part of the gluteus maximus and bicep femoris compared to the other exercises. So ultimately from this study, we can take away that the Romanian deadlift and also the Romanian chair back extension would be preferable to the seated back extension in regards to glute maximus activation. And the exercise science backs up using RDL and Romanian chair back extensions in your leg day. Even if it feels like it's not doing anything, there is science to why people do it. Okay, so the next exercise is step-ups. So the study was conducted on a group of women to evaluate the activation of all of these muscles over here. So they used 15 women that regularly engage in lower body resistance training in this study, and they performed 4 different variations of the step-up exercises. So the results demonstrated that the crossover step-up had the greatest activation of the glute medius muscles, which are these muscle groups, compared to the other step-up variation exercises. And it also demonstrated that the regular step-up had the greatest eccentric activation of the glute medius and the greatest activation for these muscle groups in both the concentric and the eccentric phases. When it comes to exercise science, the concentric phase is when your muscles are contracting and shortening. The eccentric phase is when your muscles are lengthening and like you're stepping down. So concentric is when you're stepping up. The eccentric phase is when you're stepping down. I wanted to find another exercise science study that incorporated step-ups to see if there was other evidence of step-ups being effective to have in your workout routine. And there actually was a systematic review that was done to evaluate muscle activation during certain lower body exercises. And interestingly, the systematic review compared the step-up against the hip thrust, lunges, barbell hip thrust, modified single leg squat. There were a bunch of exercises that the systematic review took a look at, and it actually found that the step-up exercise and its variations demonstrated to actually have the highest levels of glute maximus activation. So the science fully backs up you using step-ups in your workout routine, in your leg day. It makes, scientifically, it makes sense, even though sometimes I feel like sometimes you're doing exercises and it's like, what's the point? Like, is this even doing anything? The science backs it up that yes, it actually is doing something. So the next exercise is lunges, and I love lunges, especially for beginners in the gym. So there was a study that was conducted on women that were performing lunges as well as back squats, and they took a look at the EMG activity to see which exercise had greater activity during the exercise. And interestingly, lunges showed greater EMG activity than the back squat. So I wanted to find another study with women performing lunges, and I found an 8-week study that was performed on middle-aged women. In this study, a big takeaway is that lunge training improved lower body muscle function, balance, and it even reduced body fat. So lunges aren't just something that we do in the gym for aesthetics. Scientifically, they have real benefits, especially for women of all ages. So the next exercise is the leg press, which I think is really important to talk about, especially for beginners. Fortunately, most gyms, I think, at least that I've been to, always have a leg press machine. So it's a really easy or somewhat easier exercise to do in the gym. It's not that intimidating. You can kind of just like go to the machine and figure it out on your own. So a study analyzing young women found that the leg press effectively activates major muscles, the thighs, the glutes, particularly during the lifting phase of the leg press. And what I really love about the leg press, especially for beginners, is it really just allows you to build your leg strength without worrying too much about balance or technique, or if anybody in the gym is looking at you. And I feel like that can just really reduce your gym anxiety. So I think it's a great place to start. And now finally, lastly, let's talk about compound exercises. So I actually made a video a couple years ago about compound versus isolation exercises, and why compound exercises are important, why isolation exercises are important, and when to do them in your workout. If we want to talk about the science behind why we do compound exercises, there was a large systematic review that looked at resistance training, specifically in female athletes. And the review found that programs that included compound exercises significantly improved strength, muscle size, and overall body composition of the females in the studies. I think a huge takeaway from that systematic review is that we respond very well to resistance training, especially when compound exercises are incorporated. And findings from the systematic review actually indicate that resistance training or combined resistance training with other strength-dominated exercises leads to significant increases in measures of muscle power, strength, speed, and jump performance in elite female athletes. And again, you don't need to do anything crazy or complicated in the gym. Just focusing on a few compound exercises consistently can completely change your results. So hip thrusts are a great compound exercise to just have in your weekly gym routine. So if you're new to the gym, or you're not new to the gym, but you just wanted to understand the science behind why we do the exercises that we do. I hope this video was really helpful. I will link all of the studies that I have spoken about in this video will be in my description box. I am 100% open to feedback on the studies that I used. I totally understand that with research, you can always find conflicting evidence to show like, actually this exercise is better, actually this exercise is better. So I'm totally aware of that. And there are so many other considerations that need to be taken into place when you have takeaways from research studies. I was mostly looking for exercise science studies that were conducted on women. That was the number one thing that I was looking for. I totally understand that the articles aren't perfect, but they do demonstrate that there is evidence to doing all of the exercises that I mentioned in this video. If you want more science-backed, beginner-friendly gym content to watch, make sure to give this video a thumbs up. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. I really hope this was helpful.